Whenever we consider any literature, we have to consider the fact that literature is part of a larger conversation, the conversation of one person and the art form they create, and then the response from another person and the art form they create. So when we look at literature or artwork or music, we have to think of it to some degree as a conversation, one person to another. Mary Shelley's work is a work that is responding primarily to what happened just a little before her time during the revolutionary time period, which we refer to as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, which occurred in the late 18th century, produced a great many different fantastic ideas that brought Europe into the modern era, as we call it. Ideas such as the nature of government being of the people, by the people, and for the people, or ideas that modern medicine should deal with the human body as a machine, or ideas that the world itself could be changed or altered or manipulated to improve the life of human beings. These are all ideas which give us now the comforts and the society that we take for granted to a great degree. What the Enlightenment proposed was it proposed the idea that the world was itself a machine, that if there was a God, if there was a soul, that those things were things that could be altered or manipulated. God himself was a being that had created the world and stepped aside, like a clockmaker God, it was said. And so the world itself was thus a machine that we could alter or change or improve. It was something that we could come to understand. We could figure out all the details of it, and then we could improve it by creating machines ourselves. And our job as human beings, the Enlightenment proposed, was to try and improve the lot of our fellow man by the creation of machines, either machines of government or physical machines. This was the thing, the very thought process that led to, historically, the age not just of enlightenment, but the age of industry, the industrial age, or what we refer to as the Industrial Revolution. And it produced, for the first time, modern mechanics and machinery and the train, the automobile, air conditioning, refrigeration. We got things like modern transportation, modern postal system. We got our modern government was established during this era. All these different inventions occurred, which today we now use on a regular basis. So the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment before it were very beneficial in many ways. But there's a very dark side to them as well. And it was this dark side that Mary Shelley tapped into in 1816 when she first conceived her work, Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. The dark side of the Enlightenment and of the Industrial Revolution was that it proposed that there was no God, or that God was removed from this world, that there was no soul, and that man himself was just a machine within a machine. And consequently, one could manipulate man himself, control men ourselves, and we could do so by science. This led rise to things like genetics and the study of the human form in terms of genetics only, machine only. Or it gave rise, for instance, to the ideas of phrenology, that people were determined as greater or lesser in the race by the shape of our heads, some races being lesser than other races of human beings. It also gave rise to evolution, the theory of evolution, which, whether it's true or not, certainly led us to believe that we were progressing towards a greater and greater future. Other dark aspects of that then led to ideas that the human body could be animated or could be created, or we could clone human beings. And if we look at our current situation, a lot of that element of the Enlightenment has carried over into our element, our world, as something somewhat sinister, somewhat dark. The wars that we've experienced in the last 100 years, for instance, the genetic research, which seems sometimes to be going quite awry, the manipulation of the human body, the subjection of certain people based on race, all those things are dark sides of the revolution. And Mary Shelley tapped into this early on in her work, Frankenstein. The work was conceived, as the story goes, the work was conceived during a visit to Lake Geneva, the home of Lord Byron, when she and her future husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Claire Clairmont all visited Geneva during the summer of 1816. They were staying there, and it was a particularly gloomy summer. It was called the year without a summer, because there was reduced solar activity, and also a huge eruption that occurred during the year of 1815, which the volcano cast so much debris into the air that it blotted out the sun for a long period and changed the weather patterns. So while they were in Lake Geneva, the summer was particularly gloomy, dismal, rainy, cold, and they were confined indoors for most of the time. They decided then to construct horror stories, because they got to talking first about galvanism, and they got to talking about a fellow by the name of Darwin, who both of which got them to thinking about the whole nature of horror, and they thought they'd construct these stories to entertain themselves. Well, Mary Shelley herself constructed a story, Frankenstein, after a dream that she had. She dreamt that she saw this scientist bending over a corpse that he was animating, and it was particularly terrifying. She woke in a shock and a terror from this dream. And she went and wrote down elements of the dream which became the kernel of this story, Frankenstein. She wrote it when she was only 18 years old, and it was published later when she was 21. And the story itself embodies all those visions of terror that were emerging in the sense of the scientific community reanimating matter, or Galvani's work, where he had used electricity, for instance, to animate a frog, to make a frog move. Or the ideas that somehow science was going to be the answer to the human problems of the world, solve all the problems of human life. Mary Shelley conceived that there was a very dark side to all this, and she wrote this down in her book. The story behind Mary Shelley's life, though, also came into that book because she included into it something she saw, I think, in her future husband and his friend Lord Byron. Her future husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, had already been married to another woman, and he had run away with Mary Shelley, Mary Godwin at the time. And the wife had miscarried the baby, and then herself had died. And Mary Godwin, Mary Shelley, felt terribly about this, and she seemed to conceive in her husband, Percy Bysshe, and also in Lord Byron, a certain coldness and emptiness, a viewing of the world as dark and isolated, which she then put into the characters that she brings up in her book. So as we go through this book, we have a number of things we're going to be considering. We're going to be considering the modern post-Enlightenment attitude towards science and towards humanity and human life. We're going to be considering these character types that she saw in Percy Bysshe Shelley and in Byron that were cold, remote, isolated, alone characters. And we're going to be considering the imagery that she uses, water imagery and the new creation that she uses, to illustrate how she saw the world moving to a new era, a new creation of Western civilization. The title itself, if we could dwell on that lastly here, the title itself is Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. First off, the title Frankenstein does not refer to the creature, and we have a frequent misconception of this. The Frankenstein is, as we see in the Hollywood movies, the tall green guy with the bolt sticking out of his neck and the flat head. That's not Frankenstein. In the story is about Victor Frankenstein, who's the main character, who creates this creature, unnamed creature, which we'll refer to as either the creature or the monster. But the story is really about him. It's not about the creature so much as it is about Victor Frankenstein, what type of man that is. So we have to keep that in mind. The subtitle that she gives it, though, The Modern Prometheus, refers to a Greek mythology piece. Prometheus was one of the titans who actually stole fire from the gods in order to give it to humankind so that men might not be so vulnerable in the world, might not be so subject to the will of the Olympian gods. And Prometheus himself, for this deed, was chained to a mountain where he was tortured incessantly until finally rescued by Hercules. So in the modern Prometheus, we have a reference to Greek literature which suggests that what Victor Frankenstein is doing is something on the level of this god seizing fire from the divinities and bringing it down to himself. And that's very much what the Enlightenment men saw themselves doing, seizing fire from the god and determining our own future by means of machines and changing the world for the better by means of machines. So in this text, look for those various themes as we go through, and we'll highlight as much of those as we can. But here is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus?